Hello, everyone. It's Andrew with The Market Mindset. We're going to be catching up with Rabbi Yeskowitz, who's the founder of Synergist Holdings. And if you'll remember, about last year, we were speaking to him about what that whole strategy or mission statement in Synergist Holdings is. Everywhere from the energy security and transition materials that are required, baseload energy, and what they're doing specifically with Curio and next-gen fuels, advanced reactors, and fuel recycling, especially in nuclear. A lot of things to touch up on, a lot of things to catch up on, and there's been a lot of progress as we're entering this new renaissance of uranium and nuclear and solutions when you get some pushback onto that. So it's going to be a real pleasure to catch up with them, see what's happening, and see what we should be paying attention to, not only from a policy state in the US at that high level, but in the markets as well. Let's go speak with Rabbi Yeskowitz. Well, it's great to see you again, Rabbi Yeskowitz. Thank you so much for giving me some time. And like I said in the preview, really excited to get your take because you're really at the front line here of front of cycle to end of cycle of this new kind of energy boom. What are you seeing in the nuclear stage right now?
Well, first of all, let's start with the very interesting and positive news. So in COP28, they basically just came out with new nuclear rules that the U.S. and the U.K. and I'm assuming that Canada is somewhere in there. No offense to the Canadians that listen to you, but they're not mentioned in the news article. But either way, they're going to lead the pledge, triple nuclear power by 2050 at COP28. This is a Bloomberg headline, right? So, what is the idea? The idea is basically for countries to support new tech like small modular reactors, as obviously there's a resurgence of interest in nuclear power. And the reason for that is because that, as people most know, nuclear has a lot of, there's a lot of positives to nuclear, and especially for long-term baseload power generation in this country as we electrify our economy. And that is going to be the fact that it obviously is a carbon-free source of electricity. It also runs 24/7 and rain or shine, you don't have to worry about it. Once you start that reactor, it will hum along nicely. It's funny because they say that some people have this misnomer that nuclear isn't safe, but if 3 Mile Island taught us anything, which is the worst nuclear disaster, quote unquote, that happened in the Northern Hemisphere, is that you had a reactor core meltdown, and yet no one died, nothing happened, there was no explosion. The reactor actually, the worst case scenario happened, and what was supposed to happen happened, that it was safe. And the same thing happened in Fukushima. I know a lot of people don't like to talk about it, but the Fukushima happened the same thing, and even Chernobyl, which was much worse. We don't have any reactors that are designed like the Chernobyl design that had these massive graphite rods and all that kind of stuff. And we have the safety mechanisms here in the West that the Russians at the time did not have. And obviously the Russians have adopted it since. So, but let's talk numbers for a few minutes. Okay. So right now in the US alone, there's about 92 or 94 reactors that are online, and they provide about 100 gigawatts of power to the 500 or so gigawatt grid. So 20% of the US's energy comes from nuclear. It's basically its main base load of power. And give or take, you have, it's about 50% of the carbon-free power that comes to the country. In France, it's 70% of their power. So it's actually really a big deal there in France. And here in the US, it's that. And then also the reactors are being, as you know, probably being decommissioned because that there was that major movement to decommission. But I think the Canadians are ahead of the US in adapting new nuclear technologies. I think GE, if I remember correctly, is building a BWRX 300 in Canada.
Yeah.
And there's AP1000s being built in Canada. And the Canadians have their own regulatory body that is a little bit easier to work with than the NRC. So there's people who try to adapt. You have the CANDU reactors where they're doing some sort of interesting, they're moxing, which is where they're taking nuclear fuel, kind of reprocessing it, and then using the plutonium as a fuel again. So that's what the plan for those are. Here in the US, of course, we don't do that. We use 96 percent of only 4% of the energy capacity of the fuel rods is being used. We talked about this, I think, in the past.
Yeah.
And all of that. So during this whole war in Ukraine, and I don't remember if we talked about it or not, but basically the the US was not able to ban uranium imports from Russia. So because the Russians basically control the enriched uranium supply chain, especially for the UF6 portion, they have the centrifuges and stuff like that to enrich. So they basically they monopolize that entire market. And the US would have had rolling brownouts if they would have not brought in those fuels. So okay, so let's say we build another 220 more AP1000s. That's a lot of work to get to that by 2050. That means that just back of the paper napkin type of mathematics. So we'll say we have 25 years, like really 25 years left. So 220 divided by 25, we're going to need to build 8 new reactors every single year, starting 2025 to 2050. I don't know how that's happening
Yeah.
unless they like really deregulate the entire industry and open it up for innovation on a whole new scale. So that's number one. Number two, where are we getting the labor force to do this? We've basically killed skilled trade jobs in the West. They don't really exist. They're at a decline. You know, you're in the mining sector. How many kids want to do mining jobs today? It's very hard. You know, the average operator of mining the average miner that I've met are at best in their 50s. I've rarely met a young mining guy. Like I'm like one of the few young people that I know who are in mining, and I'm not even in mining. I'm just like in advanced technology development for extraction, and and I'm not an engineer. I'm just a developer and whatever you want to call me. But the bottom line is that there's no skilled trade force to build this up in 25 years. So if we want that to be built up, so let's say we're saying we're going to have by 2040, then we're going to build 200 reactors. That means that starting tomorrow, you better have at least another 10,000 nuclear engineers and mechanical engineers, etc. You need about 100,000 engineers to come out of the U.S. schooling system to develop this whole economy, right? The other thing is that what are you going to do with all that waste? So right now, the U.S. produces 2,000 metric tons of waste. If you scale that up, you're going to now produce 6,000 metric tons of waste a year. Yucca Mountain is not happening, so it's just waste going to continue accumulating. They're talking about intermittent storage, consolidated storage. They're talking about community-based storage. DOE, I've heard through the grapevine, most of the feedback that they got when they put out that RFI for the community based siting was no, thank you, we're not interested. Because there's just a concept called NIMBY, not in my backyard.
Yeah.
No one wants nuclear waste in their backyard. So you see, that obviously is a huge issue. I think the safety issue from a safety perspective is not an issue. I think that the advanced reactors are safe. There's no problem. And frankly, nuclear waste is technically safe, and it could be there forever. But here's the thing. We have in the third issue, as I kind of alluded to before, is we have a supply chain issue. Where are we getting all of that fuel from? Because right now, Russia and basically China, and maybe a little bit of France, but mostly Russia and soon to be China, control the nuclear fuel supply chain. Russia, as I probably mentioned to you before, they've invested about $20 billion into their nuclear sector, and they have now about $250 billion in international orders on their book. They're building several reactors across the globe. The Chinese are like, hold my beer. They did 450 billion with a B investment in nuclear for the Belt and Road Initiative. So they basically are going to build a $4 trillion market. So obviously that's a major challenge. So I think that like in the United States, obviously the only way that that's going to happen is if we figure out how to solve the nuclear fuel supply chain issue and is at the same time solve the nuclear waste issue. And hey, I'm all for uranium miners, uranium mining. Let's go. In situ mining today is a clean and sustainable process. It can be done, and people say like, well, why don't we mine here in the United States anymore? I think they do mine in Canada.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Athabasca up there is great. Cameco's at its all-time high. And even junior uraniums are doing well.
Buying up the whole U.S. industry. I mean, I just saw they bought up Westinghouse. The Canadians are coming. They're declaring war on us.
Yeah.
But I love it because But look, at the end of the day, as an American, it's kind of like ridiculous that the Americans just don't have their act together. And look, God bless our Secretary of Energy, Secretary Granholm, and her Assistant Secretary, Secretary Katie House. They're both trying their best, you know, they're really doing a good job. But at the end of the day, like they are picking up the pieces after an abandonment of the nuclear sector from the Clinton era, right? They
Yeah.
literally, during the Clinton era, they sold off the nuclear industry in the US for peace with Russia. And people don't actually know this, but what's called the Megatons to Megawatts program, where basically they said to the Russians, we're going to take your nuclear warheads and we're going to downblend them into fuel for the US reactors. Did you know about this program?
No, I did not at all. This is amazing. Go on.
So the Megatons to Megawatts program was where there was this United States Enrichment Corporation, the USEC, and they which is today, by the way, centrist. So what happened is that they spun it off and made it a private company. And Dan Poneman, who was working for the Clinton administration at the time, was basically handed by Al Gore this centrist company on a silver platter, and they took it over. And then they basically got the contract to do this megatons to megawatts. So who do you think was the sacrificial lamb of that entire program? The American uranium miners, because they could not compete with Russian pricing, which is subsidized heavily by the government. So the Russians were able to basically monopolize it. I'm actually writing about this in my book. I'm going to be coming out with a book hopefully next year.
Excellent.
It's going to be called The Faustian Bargain, and it's going to be about the history of the nuclear the nuclear energy sector, and kind of like from the more about like the energy side of the whole history of the energy side, not so much focused on the Manhattan Project and on that, but more focused on just how the rise and fall of the first nuclear era and what we need to do to usher in a second one.
Well, that's the thing is, I one of the questions I wanted to ask. It seems like we've had a couple of false starts, that we're on this new renaissance, and of course, that COP28 announcement was very encouraging. I would have liked to have seen in the Inflation Act, like
Inflation Reduction Act,
like more billions ushered towards nuclear, but. I mean, what are your thoughts? Do you think there's more? I mean, God, to ask more money out of Congress would be
I
really
think there
tough.
will be more money. I think that, it's funny. I talk to a lot of Republicans and to Democrats, and what I find is that both are ready to invest more nuclear. It's becoming a transpartisan issue.
Yeah.
So, and I talk to the most conservative, fiscally conservative Republicans, and they'll tell me, I support R&D for recycling if it will bring for R&D for nuclear if it brings to commercialization.
Yeah.
Like,
Okay.
they're
Great.
all about spending money if it has an ROI for the taxpayer, and that's the problem, is that if that's the case, then I tell them all the time, then Congress needs to direct better how to spend the money, because if you allow the political system to do this, then every 4 to 8 years in the US, they're shifting the energy policy.
Yeah.
And that needs to be, the energy policy in the country has to be directed by Congress. So that way there's a cohesive, long view approach.
Yes.
And that's something that I think in the West in general is a massive problem, because that every 4 to 8 years in the US, and I think there's very similar kind of timeframes in most democracies, you're finding countries are shifting their priorities between, for example, like the Trudeau administration is very different than the previous administration in their energy priorities, right?
Oh, yes.
So like anything that has to do with deep tech, anything that has to do with mining, anything that has to do with energy infrastructure, etc. When you start putting money into those industries and you start investing, you're like, wait, like, is it worth it? Because like, what's the challenge? Like, I get this question all the time. People are like, wait, if I invest with you, does that mean that like Trump is not going to support you, or vice versa? Like, does that mean that if I support you, does that mean that Biden's going to kill your pipeline? Like, that's like the kind of thing that happens. Like, oh yeah, mining, yeah, it's great. You have all this antimony or all of this aluminum or whatever, and you're like, but like, wait, but like, if the liberals if the liberals take over, then they're going to ban mining, and vice versa. You're like, okay, let's get involved in this solar and wind company, And you're like, yeah, but then the conservative folks are going to come in here and they're going to pump oil and gas and they're just going to shut these all
Yes.
down, right?
Yeah.
So we need an all of the above approach where everything is kind of being done holistically and with thought in a well thought out process. And that is not happening right now.
No. Yeah.
And I think that that's kind of like where we are. And let's take a case in point. So obviously everybody's right now in the nuclear sector kind of tracking what's going on with NuScale.
Yes.
Okay. And we wanted to talk about that. So NuScale is a small modular reactor, but not all small modular reactors are created equal. See that they're very good at kind of generalizing things.
Yeah.
Like a gas cooled reactor or a molten salt reactor is very different than is very, very different than is very different than a light water reactor, small modular reactor, which is exactly what the NuScale version is. It's a light water reactor, but in a smaller design. And originally with this UAMPS deal, when they started it, so the federal government obviously was very bullish that we have to like rebuild our supply chain. And at the time, NuScale was like basically the only show in town. So everybody basically was like, well, if they're the only suckers who want to do it, then we'll just try to get them to get into it. And everybody started saying small modular reactors, blah, 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 blah. And then, it's also not that hard to get an NRC license for a reactor that is exactly the same as any other reactor, but it's just a little smaller. Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, the NRC makes it hard as it is. And there's a lot of need for reformation of the NRC, and the NRC themselves, I think will agree with you that they need some reforms, but that's a different story. But they originally said they were going to give the electricity at a 57 cents per kilowatt hour price. And then before you know it, it ballooned up to something in the high 80s, low
86.
90s.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then what happened? Then you end up with these UAMs, which is already like the wrong utility to pick for this project. To then the whole point is that 80% of the collective of this conglomerate had to agree to do it.
Yeah.
And a lot of these small utilities are controlled by like the local city council or whatever, and they're like, we don't want this. We'd rather just stick to our diesel generator.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, why would we spend all this money when we could buy a $150,000 diesel generator, over a $150 million reactor, which is what every module probably costs. So then it just didn't go anywhere, right? And they knew for a long time already it was going to be a problem. And but look, and then obviously the Biden administration worked out some sort of deal with the Romanians to take it on, and they have a couple other customers, and whether it's in the Bitcoin space or the data mining space, or also Duke Energy is looking to build one. So like, and those are not getting canceled. There's a lot of positive things going for this company, but at the same time, all you need is that one first project that was their like quote unquote government funded project to go and say no and go bust. And now everybody's in panic mode. I don't know if you saw, there's now a class action lawsuit being by one of these like ambulance chaser law firms suing them for lying to their investors after that report came out.
Yeah.
It's so bad because that what it does is that it basically stifles innovation when you have these abilities to do these class action lawsuits.
Yeah.
Like at the end of the day, I think NuScale is going to be able to prove that they're innocent, but it's going to cost them probably more than $1 million in legal fees.
Yeah.
Right. And it's going to make all the attorneys rich regardless.
Yeah.
And it also hurts the nuclear sector, and it hurts the whole, that's why originally in the Constitution, there was a First Amendment protection that you could take someone and challenge them to a duel, right?
Yeah.
Like if you don't like what the other person says, you better be careful. You could say whatever you want, but if he doesn't like it, he's going to challenge you to a duel. We don't do that anymore today, but I feel bad for NuScale, and I think it's very bad for the nuclear industry on an optics level. I think that I cannot. I'm very optimistic about NuScale, and I want them to succeed. But at the same time, I'm not going to bet my bottom dollar and say that it's going to be guaranteed, because that right now, it's literally I think it's like a open season, and we're going to see a lot of interesting things happening. And I think that like if you want to get a sense of what the market is, you just have to look at the fact that Ares Capital did not end up doing the X Energy SPAC, which they were going to do. So they obviously feel like the market's really bad.